She said, "You remind me of someone." But it was her eyes that whispered everything she couldn't say. The moment I stepped into my aunt's home, a strange mixture of comfort and curiosity settled over me. It wasn't just the familiarity of the space, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint aroma of lavender from a candle on the counter, but the way she moved through it, as if every corner of the house belonged to her, yet somehow still invited me in. She was standing near the window, the sunlight spilling over her shoulders, highlighting the subtle silver threads in her dark hair. There was an effortless grace in the way she turned toward me, the gentle sway of her posture, and the way her eyes, calm yet piercing, immediately found mine. She smiled, a small, almost knowing smile, and for a moment I felt like she could see past the surface, right into the thoughts I hadn't even spoken aloud. "You remind me of someone," she said, her voice soft and slightly hesitant, as if weighing each word before letting it float across the room. But it wasn't just the words, it was her eyes. They lingered on me with a quiet intensity that left me unsettled in the best way possible, as though she were trying to bridge some gap I didn't yet understand. I shifted my weight awkwardly, aware of the tiny echo of my heartbeat in the stillness between us. The air seemed warmer where she stood, carrying a faint scent of vanilla and something uniquely her own, the smell of familiarity and subtle elegance intertwined. As she moved toward the kitchen, the hem of her flowing cardigan brushing lightly against her thighs, I caught myself noticing the way she gestured with her hands, precise yet relaxed, each motion natural and unstudied. We exchanged small talk, the kind that feels ordinary but somehow carries a hidden undertone. She asked about my work, my weekends, and there was an ease to her curiosity, a genuine interest that made me lean a little closer than I might have normally. Our hands brushed as she handed me a mug of tea, and the fleeting warmth of contact sent a ripple of awareness through me. It was subtle, almost accidental, but not unnoticed. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her fingers against mine, the light pressure that lingered just long enough to matter. There was a rhythm to our interaction, a delicate dance of familiarity, and something unspoken, threaded through every glance, every brush of her hair behind her ear, every pause where her gaze met mine and held. I found myself wondering who the someone was she referred to, and why the thought of it seemed to ripple through the air between us. It wasn't romantic yet, at least, not in any conscious way, but there was a tension, an invisible cord connecting us that neither of us dared to name aloud. As the afternoon sunlight shifted, casting golden patterns across the living room floor, I realized I was already paying attention to things I usually ignored: the soft cadence of her voice, the curve of her smile, the unspoken history carried in her eyes. That first moment of quiet recognition had passed, yet it lingered, subtle and insistent, planting the seed of a connection that promised to grow deeper, more intimate, and far more meaningful than either of us could yet imagine. By the second day of my stay, a subtle shift had begun to settle over our interactions, one that I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. The small moments, the ones that would usually pass unnoticed, now seemed charged with quiet significance. Her presence had a way of filling the room without demanding attention, and I found myself noticing details I hadn't before: the way her fingers trailed lightly over the edge of a book, the soft creak of her chair as she shifted to face me, the gentle tilt of her head when she laughed at one of my jokes. There was a warmth in her eyes that lingered just a beat longer than expected, a hesitation that made my chest tighten in a strange, thrilling way. It started with little touches, accidental, or so I told myself. A brief brush of her hand as she handed me a plate, the soft press of her palm against my arm as she guided me through a crowded doorway. Each contact was fleeting, delicate, and somehow meaningful. The warmth of her skin lingered on mine, leaving an echo I couldn't shake. I noticed my own reactions too, the slight quickening of my pulse, the subtle pull of my attention toward her whenever she moved, the unbidden smile that spread across my face when our eyes met. Her movements were graceful, yet casual, effortless in their familiarity. She leaned against the counter, one hand resting lightly on her hip, her other hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. I caught the sunlight in her hair, the way it shimmered with a hint of gold, and I realized I was watching her longer than necessary, trying not to let her see the curiosity and admiration in my gaze. and yet she seemed to notice. Sometimes, our eyes would meet and hold, and for a moment, the world shrank to just the two of us. There was no need for words. The weight of the look itself said more than either of us could speak aloud. We spent a quiet afternoon in the living room, each absorbed in our own tasks, yet aware of the other's presence in an almost magnetic way. She laughed at something I said, a soft, melodic sound, and I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn by the warmth and ease of it. When she shifted to reach for a notebook on the table, our hands brushed again, this time longer, deliberate but not overt, and a shiver ran through me. It was intoxicating in its subtlety, a gentle acknowledgement of connection without needing to name it. And yet, beneath the comfort and playfulness, there was a growing awareness of something unspoken. The age gap, the family ties, the societal expectations, all lingered at the edges of my mind, whispering caution even as my heart ignored them. Her eyes held stories I couldn't yet decipher, glances that hinted at memories and emotions beyond my understanding. I sensed a quiet longing, a mix of tenderness and hesitation, and I realized that the simple act of looking at her had become charged with meaning. By the end of the day, I understood that these small gestures, these lingering glances and fleeting touches, had begun to weave a quiet, invisible bond between us. It was slow, deliberate, and unspoken, but it was there, tangible in its intensity. And even though either of us had named it yet, I felt the first stirrings of a connection that would not be easily forgotten, one that promised warmth, intimacy, and attention that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting to grow. By the third day, the rhythm of our days together had settled into a quiet, comfortable familiarity. It was no longer just her presence that drew my attention, it was the small, intimate details that made the air between us feel charged with a gentle, unspoken connection. That evening, we found ourselves lingering in the living room long after dinner, the house dimly lit by the golden glow of a table lamp. The hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside became a soft background to our conversation, which drifted effortlessly from trivial anecdotes to more personal recollections. She spoke first, her voice low and measured, as if choosing each word with care. A story from her past, a memory of someone she had cared deeply for, unfolded in a way that revealed both warmth and regret. Her eyes, reflecting the soft lamplight, seemed to carry the weight of unspoken emotions, and I realized I was leaning slightly closer, drawn by a need to understand and connect. There was no judgment in her expression, only a quiet openness that invited me to share in her world. When my turn came, I hesitated at first, unsure how much to reveal. Yet the trust in her gaze, the way she waited, patient and unpressured, coaxed my voice into a steadier tone. I found myself speaking of my own fears, small regrets, and insecurities, the kind I rarely voiced aloud. She listened with an intensity that was both comforting and disarming, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the sofa near mine. I felt the warmth radiating from her, a subtle energy that grounded me even as my heart raced in response to the closeness of her presence. At one point, our hands brushed as I adjusted my position, and instinctively, she allowed her fingers to linger against mine. It was a simple, fleeting touch, yet it carried an intimacy far deeper than words could express. I felt the gentle steadiness of her hand, the slight warmth beneath my palm, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Neither of us moved away. Instead, we sat in that quiet connection, a shared vulnerability bridging the age gap and the unspoken social boundaries that usually kept people apart. The conversation ebbed and flowed, moments of silence punctuating the stories we exchanged. In those pauses, I noticed the way her eyes softened when she glanced at me, the slight tilt of her head as if listening not just to my words but to the emotions behind them. The room felt cocooned from the outside world, a private space where honesty and tenderness could exist without fear. By the end of the evening, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. This was more than admiration or fleeting attraction. It was the beginning of emotional intimacy, a connection built on trust, empathy, and the courage to be seen. The subtle tension between us remained, yet it was no longer tentative or uncertain. It had become a steady current, threading through our gestures, our touches, and our lingering glances. And as she finally stood to leave for the night, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, I felt the quiet ache of wanting to prolong the moment, knowing that our bond had deepened in a way that neither of us could yet fully name. By the fourth day, the quiet familiarity between us had grown into something more nuanced, a delicate dance of attention, curiosity, and subtle teasing. The tension that had been simmering beneath our interactions now surfaced in small, playful ways, as if both of us were testing the boundaries of comfort without ever overstepping. It began in the kitchen that morning, sunlight spilling through the windows and catching the gentle curves of her face, highlighting the warmth in her smile. She noticed the way I absent-mindedly stirred my coffee and raised an eyebrow. "You really do remind me of someone," she said, her voice light and teasing, though her eyes held that same unreadable depth as before. I laughed, unsure whether to respond seriously or play along, but the look in her eyes made me pause. There was recognition there, yes, but also something more, a spark of shared amusement, as if we were both in on a private joke that existed only between us. The day unfolded with small, intimate moments that carried more weight than either of us acknowledged. When I reached for the sugar, her hand lightly brushed mine, lingering just long enough to create an unspoken tension. It wasn't necessary, the task could have been completed without the contact, but the warmth of her skin, the slight pressure of her fingers, and the way her gaze met mine with a teasing lilt made my pulse quicken. I felt acutely aware of the age difference and the boundaries it implied, yet in that moment, none of it mattered. Later, we were sorting through old family albums she had pulled out from a shelf. She chuckled softly at a picture of someone she once knew, someone whose features, she said, were similar to mine. Her laughter was soft, melodic, and entirely captivating, and as she leaned closer to show me a photograph, her shoulder brushed against mine. The simple contact sent a ripple of warmth up my arm, and I felt a strange, thrilling awareness of proximity that was new and unfamiliar. Throughout the day, she teased me gently about habits I hadn't noticed she was observing, the way I wrinkled my nose when concentrating, or the careful way I organized small objects on a table. It was playful, almost affectionate, and yet it carried a quiet undercurrent of something deeper. Each teasing remark was accompanied by a look that lingered too long to be casual, her eyes holding layers of meaning that words alone couldn't convey. By evening, as we sat together on the couch, a soft blanket draped over our knees, I realized that the playful recognition had become a bridge between comfort and longing. Our laughter was genuine, but the pauses between jokes, the glances that held just a touch too long, and the accidental touches were all loaded with an unspoken intimacy. She leaned back slightly, letting her hair fall over one shoulder, and I found myself stealing a careful glance, captivated by the effortless grace of her movements. In that moment, I understood that the playfulness was more than just teasing, it was a way of communicating what neither of us could yet put into words. It was recognition, curiosity, and a tentative desire wrapped into one delicate dance. The emotional tension had grown tangible, subtle yet persistent, weaving through our gestures, our shared laughter, and the quiet glances that lingered a heartbeat too long. It was a promise of connection, unspoken yet unmistakable, that hinted at deeper intimacy still to come. By the fifth day, the subtle warmth and playful intimacy that had developed between us had grown into something heavier, something that neither of us could fully name, yet both felt in the pit of our stomachs. The house felt smaller somehow, as if every glance, every gesture, and every laugh carried more weight than before. I noticed how she lingered near me a fraction longer than necessary, or how the light in her eyes softened when she spoke, as though weighing the consequences of revealing more than what words allowed. I found myself second-guessing my own reactions. Was it admiration? Affection? Something deeper that I didn't yet have the language to describe? The age gap, her role as my aunt, and the subtle societal expectations gnawed at my mind, creating a tension I hadn't anticipated. Every time our hands brushed, accidental or otherwise, a flush of heat spread across my chest, but I quickly chastised myself, reminding my rational mind of the boundaries I was meant to uphold. Her own hesitation was equally apparent. There were moments when she paused mid-sentence, her eyes searching mine as if trying to read my intentions. Sometimes she would tilt her head slightly, brushing a hand over her hair, a subtle sign of uncertainty and vulnerability. I could feel the pull of unspoken desire in the spaces between us, in the way she lingered near the doorway, in the soft cadence of her voice, and in the way her gaze followed me across the room. But just as quickly she would step back, restoring a cautious distance that reminded me both of the closeness we shared and the boundaries we couldn't cross. That evening, we sat together in the living room, the soft lamplight casting shadows across her face. She reached for a book on the table, and as our hands met, the contact lingered longer than either of us intended. A shiver ran up my arm, not from the touch itself, but from the emotional intensity that accompanied it. Our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I felt both longing and restraint, a fragile balance that neither of us dared disturb. Internally, I struggled with my feelings. I wanted to lean closer, to close the space between us, yet the voice of reason warned me to stop. Every small interaction became a test of self-control, a fleeting brush of fingers, a shared laugh, a glance that lingered too long. The tension was tangible, a quiet hum beneath our conversations, pulsing with the possibility of connection but tempered by the awareness of consequence. Her presence was magnetic, yet safe in its complexity. Every hesitant smile, every subtle gesture, every pause in her voice conveyed a mixture of warmth, curiosity, and caution. And I realized that this hesitation, this careful dance of restraint and longing, was a necessary part of what made our bond feel so profound. It was a delicate negotiation of boundaries and desire, a silent acknowledgement that the connection we shared was significant and meaningful, even if unspoken. By the end of the night, the unspoken tension had reached a quiet, simmering peak. We both knew the emotional pull between us was real, but for now, it existed in the space of lingering touches, fleeting glances, and restrained gestures. The hesitation and inner conflict were not obstacles. They were markers of the depth of our emotions, signaling that what had begun as playful familiarity was evolving into something far more intimate, charged with possibility yet wrapped in the careful cloak of restraint. By the sixth day, the emotional tension between us had grown impossible to ignore. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, it was quiet, insistent, like the gentle pull of tides, urging us closer without words. The warmth of her presence, the subtle ways she moved, the lingering glances we shared, had created a space in which silence could speak as loudly as conversation. That evening, after a long walk through the quiet streets near her home, we returned, the cool evening air mingling with the soft warmth that still lingered from the day. We settled into the living room, her favorite blanket draped loosely over the back of the couch. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed as she sank into the cushions, a slight exhale escaping her lips, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. I sat close enough that our knees brushed, the contact small yet deliberate, grounding me in the intensity of the moment. Our conversation was light at first, but beneath the words, a tension hummed, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been building between us. Then, as though compelled by something larger than thought, she reached for my hand. The touch was soft, tentative, but deliberate, a gentle clasp that communicated trust, curiosity, and something more profound. I felt the warmth of her skin seep into mine, the steadiness of her fingers anchoring my scattered thoughts. Her eyes met mine, searching, questioning, yet offering reassurance. It was as if in that simple gesture, she was confessing what words could not, the connection, the affection, the quiet longing that had been simmering beneath the surface for days. I responded instinctively, my hand tightening ever so slightly around hers, a small yet meaningful gesture of reciprocation. She leaned a little closer, her cheek brushing against my shoulder, and I became acutely aware of the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle rise and fall that mirrored my own. The moment was fleeting, intimate, and safe, yet it carried an emotional weight that made my heart ache with both desire and tenderness. We didn't need to speak. The shared silence, the light squeeze of her hand, the fleeting warmth of her cheek against my shoulder, said everything we both wanted to express but couldn't yet voice aloud. There was no rush, no expectation, just a mutual acknowledgement of our feelings, tender and unspoken. I felt her thumb brush against the back of my hand, a small, lingering movement that resonated deep within me, confirming that this bond we had nurtured was real and profound. For the first time, I realized that intimacy wasn't only about words or grand gestures. It was the gentle touch, the quiet attention, the way she let me see her vulnerability without fear. It was the subtle closeness, the way our physical proximity mirrored the emotional connection we had built over days of laughter, teasing, and shared stories. In that quiet evening, with the lamplight casting soft shadows across the room, we had crossed a threshold, not into romance overtly, but into a space where trust, desire, and tenderness coexisted in perfect harmony. As she finally leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to breathe, I felt a deep, unspoken certainty. The emotional bond between us had reached a new height. It was no longer just playful glances or lingering touches. It was something richer, something real, something that promised warmth, closeness, and the delicate thrill of love waiting to bloom fully in its own time. By the seventh day, the tension, curiosity, and unspoken affection that had been building between us reached a quiet, satisfying crescendo. The house, which had felt like a stage for our tentative interactions, now felt like a sanctuary, a space where emotions could finally exist without restraint. The sunlight slanted through the windows, casting golden highlights across the room, illuminating the gentle lines of her face and the subtle warmth in her eyes that had always drawn me in. We found ourselves on the porch, the evening air cool but gentle, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the garden. A soft blanket lay across our laps, but it was the closeness of our presence that created the real warmth. We sat side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing, the contact familiar and comforting rather than fleeting or accidental. The day had passed in a haze of shared stories, laughter, and quiet touches, but now it felt like everything had led to this single, unhurried moment. She turned toward me, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset, and smiled softly. I felt a deep ache of recognition, not of desire in the shallow sense, but of profound connection and understanding. The unspoken acknowledgement of everything we had shared was in that look, in the gentle tilt of her head, in the way her fingers brushed against mine as she adjusted the blanket. It was a silent promise that whatever bond we had cultivated over these days was real, respected, and safe. I reached for her hand, letting my fingers intertwine with hers. The warmth of her skin was comforting, grounding me in the present. She didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand in mine, subtle pressure speaking louder than words ever could. Her cheek tilted toward me, brushing lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath, a quiet intimacy that was more profound than any declaration. The emotional distance that had lingered in previous days had softened, replaced by a mutual understanding that transcended the ordinary boundaries of our relationship. We spoke in hushed tones, sharing reflections on the week, our laughter mingling with the soft evening sounds outside. Yet even when words paused, the connection persisted. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every gentle shift closer carried meaning. There was no rush, no need to define what we were, only the quiet satisfaction of being present with each other, of nurturing a bond built on trust, respect, and affection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I realized that the story we had created together was complete, yet not confined. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was about the steady, patient growth of feelings and the way small, meaningful interactions could shape a connection more powerful than words. The hesitation, the playful glances, the vulnerability, and the tender touches had all led us here, to this warm, unspoken understanding that whatever the future held, we had found something rare and precious. Finally, she leaned back slightly, resting her head against my shoulder, and I felt the quiet beat of her heart echo against mine. In that serene evening, we existed in a space where age, expectation, and uncertainty no longer mattered. What remained was a deep, abiding closeness, a YouTube-safe, emotionally satisfying resolution where affection, trust, and subtle romantic desire coexisted in perfect harmony. The story had reached its gentle, heartfelt conclusion, leaving both of us profoundly aware of the bond we had nurtured and the quiet joy of simply being together.